This is the Early AI podcast hosted by Seth Earley. Join us as we delve deep into the passions, expertise, and experiences of thought leaders and practitioners to talk about what's possible with artificial intelligence. The Early AI podcast is sponsored by Early Information Science, your digital transformation journey with design and deployment of innovative technology solutions, as well as Vector. Now enjoy the show.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whatever your time zone is. Welcome to the Early AI podcast. And in our podcast series, we basically talk about what organizations are doing to be successful with AI, what the challenges are to that success, how to get from proof of concept to production, how to deal with data issues, how to deal with agent issues, security, compliance, all of those types of things. Today, we're going to talk about something that's very high stakes for organizations, and that is really when you're doing enterprise data migration, how does that impact the organization when it comes to AI initiatives, when you're doing a merger, when you're doing a divestiture, an SAP platform upgrade? The data has to move. And so if something goes wrong during that process, there's certainly significant impact to the business, and it can be very consequential. And of course, when we are trying to leverage AI in all of these initiatives, which is what we're doing now, we introduce new factors, new risks, new compliance issues, new challenges that didn't exist necessarily in prior iterations of this. We've always used AI to do things like data cleansing or use machine learning, shall I say. We used to call it things like text analytics and data architecture, and now everything is AI, but it's still some of the fundamental principles that we've used before the advent of generative AI, which is the recent iteration that people are so excited about. So there's very little room for error when we're doing things like migrations. There's one anecdote, and I'm not sure if you gave us this, Dominic, but $5 million per hour when a system was down or when an organization was down, an enterprise critical system was down. So my guest today is Dominic Wittenbeck. He's Group CTO of SNP Group, which is a 1,600 person global consulting firm that has spent 30 software and solutions firm that has spent 30 years doing SAP-centric data migration. Dominic has been with the company for 25 of those years, and he spent most of that time doing something that will resonate with our listeners, talking about what's inside the heads of experienced consultants, codifying that into structured, reusable knowledge. SNP now has what they call a transformational repository covering millions of data points across the SAP data model, plus guided procedures with 1,500 discrete steps for running a migration. This is 15 years of formalized enterprise expertise. And now they're building agent-based AI systems to work on top of all that knowledge repository. And this is what we're finding is that organizations that are doing extremely well with AI are using those repositories, are using that institutional knowledge and using that to drive many of the AI initiatives. So Dominic, welcome to the show. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Seth. Thank you for having me.
So, we are in the Northeast, and we're getting more and more snow here. How is it in your neck of the woods? You're in Germany. Where exactly are you?
In Heidelberg. And actually, I can say we had kind of a winter this year for decades. Probably my little ones have been seeing snow for the first time for real.
Wow.
But I mean, it's starting to get spring here already. Yeah. We had like the first warm couple days, basically. Yeah. Nights are not cool so much anymore. So I think
we're hoping for spring weather. So we'd like to start off by asking people about misconceptions. So you operate in a domain where the consequences are very significant. So when you talk to executives about applying AI in your space, in data migration and doing these redeployments, replatforming, what are the biggest misunderstandings that you come across?
I think mostly it is like AI will solve basically everything. I mean, the field that we're in, and you already expanded on this is born out of an expertise out of 2 decades plus. Basically, where I think I spent most of my professional career with extracting the knowledge from consultants and trying to formulate it in a way that actually fits into software, basically. And now, when I think the biggest misconception is that AI is going to be the silver bullet that basically heals all out of thin air. But actually, ultimately, what it needs, I mean, everybody is aware of that in order to train AI, you need data. Nobody would question that even, right? But in order to run complicated and the life-depending systems, but systems which basically have a critical impact on your business, they need enough grounding. They need to make sure that whenever an agent runs, it really runs on a foundation that is probably not out there in common knowledge. So you actually need to feed the knowledge into the agentic system that you're building on top of in order really to make sure that you get deterministic results in the end. And I think the misconception is that, hey, this all becomes very easy, and making it basically I can save time, I can save cost type of problem, where in reality, what you really want to make sure when you're getting yourselves into data migration is that you're doing it correct, that you're doing it efficiently, that you're doing it safe and sound and audible in the end. Because, I mean, ultimately, your system is going to get audited, and whatever stuff has been done in there incorrectly, it will surface at some point, and you have to make sure that this doesn't happen at basically all cost.
Yeah, that's a great point in the fact that it is about risk mitigation. It's about doing it correctly. It's not necessarily about doing it as cheaply as possible, because sometimes cheap is quite costly, and sometimes slowing down speeds things up. So we have to be thoughtful about this. One of the things that we talked a little bit about was that data migration requires that you have teams of specialists who understand the sources and the destination systems, and that an individual, there's too much complexity to hold in one person's head, right? And that's where you have a lot of friction. We have different people that have different areas of specialization, and many times that is difficult to scale. So clearly, this is, an expertise, a classic expertise bottleneck. And how has that scaling constraint, shaped your approach to AI? Obviously, this is something where, it's kind of an ideal use case, but tell me how you've thought about it, and tell me maybe what some of the experiments look like, and then how you formulated your approach that has been working for you.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, migration is a team sport, basically. If anything else, I mean, you always say when you build a product or when you build anything, you want to have basically functional teams, right? You want to have interdisciplinary teams that you mix people from the business with technical people to actually get the best outputs and to get the best results. Now, in data migration, even you're basically operating, well, you're modernizing a system basically full-fledged all the way through, all the processes you're going to touch, all the data you're going to touch. You have to make sure that everything basically is perfect. So you have to get a lot of people actually into the game, both from the customer and also, of course, from the SI or for whomever does the data migration in this particular piece. So how does AI really help in this particular regard? And to be honest, it starts even way before you actually hit any particular data transformation tooling, like you might think. I'll be talking about like building data pipelines. And yeah, believe me, I will talk about building data pipes and stuff like that. But the problems or the challenges even start way before, right? Because what you typically start with when you are being presented with a data migration opportunity at a customer, they start with an RFP. And it shows like, where do they actually want to go? It doesn't necessarily state where do they actually come from. So what we experience always, and that was even before AI was a thing, so for like 15 years or so, our approach to the subject always was get as much transparency into the process of the as-is situation, so you can evaluate very precisely how to actually get to the to-be situation, right? So we were always running something like a scan on the source systems to really truthfully understand facts and figures about how the system was used, which modules were in place, which processes were run, which data was actually on these systems, to what degree was it on there, and so on and so forth. This type of things. So with that said, what you need in any AI operations is foundational knowledge, which is specific and not generic to the underlying problems. So you need that data to understand and flesh out the way into the future. So even at the very beginning of such a project, when you're fleshing out the solutioning and say like, okay, this is about like how we're going to move the data. That is the decisions that you need to make because of the inconsistencies that see on the source. Using AI to basically bring all this together, even in something just as condensed as a very distinct and concrete and built to the customer survey that makes sure that you're really hitting all the points and all the decision that needs to be made can be made as the earliest point in time is something where I basically already helps. And that's not even downstream building it too much into a platform that actually does the data movement and actually does the data migration.
So maybe you could put a little bit finer point on this. So this is a situation where you need to bring specialists together. You have reference procedures and rule bases and methodologies. So you're not necessarily just bolting on, a virtual assistant to answer questions. How are you actually using this to accelerate what the team is doing? So give me kind of a before and an after, right? If you did a project a couple of years ago without, any AI assistance, with minimal compared to what we have today, what did that look like versus what it looks like today using some of the agentic approaches? And again, how is it kind of integrated into the workflow and the work processes? Is that a fair
Okay.
question?
So let's virtually run through basically a project and basically see at what points, right, stuff has changed because of agentic capabilities that basically came into play. So if we basically pick it up of where we just left it off in the conversation, at basically the pre-sales phase, at the solutioning phase, we are trying to find out where actually you want to basically be and how the thing's going to be laid out. One of the next things that typically has happened, basically craft a project timeline. You craft basically a project step and methodology in there. You craft a blueprint basically about how your migration is going to be. Of course, I mean, crafting the blueprint itself, if you give it the proper template, which we formulated basically over years, is something which is much easier to do if you can basically just, slap it into AI and get a good proposal to begin with. I'm always saying a good proposal to begin with, because ultimately you as a human being, as the person who's the solution engineer or enterprise architect in that particular case, you will have to take responsibility and accountability for the end result. So I always take stuff that the AI spits out at that point as a proposal. So you have that. Basically, you were perfectly prepped. What you next take basically is you take this thing and you actually run and build a data pipeline from the actual pieces. So it will take you through the different steps. And the platform that we have has something like guided procedures in them that, as you said, it's like it's not millions of steps, but it's thousands of steps which are interdependent basically. But they're not necessary for all of the different pieces. They're basically like crafting out almost all the eventualities that might happen. And now with the blueprint in there, we can dynamically switch on and off all the things. So the pre-configuration of this scenario that would typically be done manually now, of course, is being sped up much in that regard. Next, what you typically have to do is you have to craft an individual rule base. So when you have the procedure right and what steps you need to take, typically what happens is like, okay, we need these and these objects basically, and we have templates for that as well, but then you need to like adjust them because maybe you're changing the chart of account in a certain degree, right? Or you're reorganizing your profit centers along the way, or your cost center structure, or your organization in general while you're doing that. And you would typically go down that route because if you're an IT leader, what you typically want to do is you will want to become the enabler of the business. So while a typical system organization at first hand might seem like, oh, let's get it over and done with and make it as cheap as possible, if you're like smart about it, you can also say like, okay, this is a chance of change anyhow. Let's incorporate business benefits that streamline accounting downstream, right? Or that enable better reporting capabilities, which ultimately lead to better planning experiences. And if you want to take that, this will end up in rules that you're formulating, like how you want to reshape your organization. Now, these rules typically would, in former times, have been encoded directly in the software. So you would configure mapping lists and stuff like that and flesh out rules in scripts and so on and so forth. Now, much of the things can now be scaffolded, of course, with the help of AI, right? So still, we're using the underlying system and the way of how it's been executed, but the rule generation, right, the crafting of the pipeline, that's what actually gets accelerated. Now, let's say you have all of that done already. You actually now run the pipeline. And what you really want to make sure is that it runs exactly as it would have run traditionally, meaning deterministic. So from whatever same inputs you give it, you get exactly the same outputs, because that ultimately is a necessity for an auditable system that you want to have in the end. Now, I'll stop right there, because at the end of the process, when we get to testing and we get to validation of those pieces, there's a whole lot more that AI can actually do nowadays versus former times where much of the testing actually would have need to be done manually.
So, what you're saying is even when you're doing data migration planning, you are still looking at process engineering. You're still looking at doing some optimization. Is that correct?
Well, most of the times customers are looking for this optimization, and you as the vendor for doing the data migration actually has to realize them and make sure that they actually do happen, basically. So the initial intent or the initial spark typically comes from customers craving for, hey, let's become an enabler of the business. Let's, while we move this whole stuff all together, take the chance of the change that we're going to go through anyhow, and don't do another project a year down the road, but inline this right away this time. So the time to value that I'm providing as an IT head to my organization increases.
Yeah, and I always talk about the fact that if you're moving, say, stuff from one system to another, and you say, well, we'll clean it up later, right? That's never going to happen. It's like moving from one house to another, and you have an attic full of boxes and junk and stuff. And when you're moving it, you just move it to the new attic, and you say, oh, we'll clean it up later. No, you're not going to clean it up when you're moving it. You're never going to clean it up, right? So this is kind of looking at that, that from that perspective, but you're also kind of, so what does this really mean to an organization, and give, when they're going about these initiatives, and tell me more about, is it simply a matter of saying, I mean, what's the takeaway here? Is it simply a matter of saying, look for your vendors to use AI to improve the efficiency? Everybody's looking for that. Or are there things that they need to do in order to prepare for a vendor coming in and doing this migration and doing this replatforming that they need to think about in advance? Like, what's different? I kind of want to know what's the different, what's new, what's different, what's the takeaway for AI-enabled data migration and replatforming versus what they've done in the past. And part of what you're saying is look at the bigger process, look for where you want to build efficiencies, look for the efficiencies that AI can provide, both in terms of the migration, the data cleansing, but also in terms of the functionality that you're looking for. What else? Is there anything else that you would add to that list?
I mean, ultimately, of course, we would be happy if like systems would have been cleansed already, because it would make our job so much easier, right? As you just like made the example, when you move over, you have like once of a lifetime or once of a legislation period time of chance, actually, as a CIO, to now make things clean again. I mean, they will decay and go downstream, or will go downhill from there anyhow, right? But it's like a once in a lifetime chance that you actually can take, and you can basically piggyback right on these things. But you have to also like carefully choose, right? Because the more change you incorporate, I mean, data cleansing is not so much of a change really. It's like more of a housekeeping task that you can do alongside. But more of a change that impacts the business later is, of course, a burden that the business has to take within this project. What we always say, like, hey, cater to what your organization, or cater the project and the scope that you put in the project to what your organization can actually digest. To be honest, it doesn't have so much to do with AI ultimately, right? Because it's much about like, how can you manage people, how you can get them excited about the new system that, well, sits there in glory on the mountain top right there in the distance, and it's all going to be better. And I mean, you're probably exhausted by the time that you get there. Maybe AI makes it a little bit less exhausting to ultimately go there, but the change management that you need to do, that get people on board, of course, gets harder the more change you accumulate in one project. And that's something that you would need to consider. And for me, to be honest, that's something which is independent of AI. The only thing that really, really matters and helps here really is that making it clear what the impact is through like interpretation of analytics, the recommendations or the summaries that you can get out of results of analytics, make it maybe a little bit more tangible to make this presentable, so you can make a more informed choice and don't do naive choices basically along the way.
So you make a good observation. There's always the pace of change exceeding the ability to absorb change. And that happens at multiple levels. Right now, it's happening with developers, right? The pace of change, the technology is happening faster than developers can process and assimilate and apply. Now, of course, the AI tools are helping with that, because they can take out a lot of the heavy lifting around coding, but then that still presents overload of what the capabilities are. So if you can build these capabilities more quickly, you're giving the organization more things to absorb, right? And we're seeing that quite a bit. And then the technology changes faster than business can change. The marketplaces change faster than the culture can change. So there's this trade-off between recency, currency, and the ability to absorb that change. And as you say, there's a lot of that having to do with socialization and change management more than it is the tools themselves. So again, when an organization is looking at one of these catalysts around, say, replatforming, what do you see driving the migrations these days? Is it the acquisition, the divestiture, the new platforms, or is it looking at AI native applications, or is it supporting migration and cleansing for AI? What are the big drivers and catalysts that you're seeing right now in the marketplace?
Okay, maybe the market and our own perception might be a little bit different right now. The
Sure.
biggest
Your
that we get,
perspective.
from our perspective. So the biggest push that we are getting is, of course, because of the wave to S4, basically. But to be honest, I mean, that's a wave which like started off like 10 years ago already. So, but the
That's
question,
the SAP. That's the
SAP S4, yeah. For everybody who's not familiar, I mean, SAP is one of the biggest vendors like globally to supply ERP systems, basically. And they recently, like 10 years ago, announced basically a shift from their ECC to the S4 platform, which is undergoing basically ever since. The reason for why this has been taking so long for organizations to digest and even to like start adopting at this point is they invested already for 25 years into these old systems, optimizing them. And one of the key features or one of the key selling points for SAP always was the high degree of customizations that you can actually apply into the system to make it really diverse, to make it really like specialized, to optimize for your own processes and for your own benefit. And then, of course, if you basically have to restructure this, maybe even go into a standardized application set in the future, makes you think hard about, hey, what can you actually let go and what you actually should be taking. So I think modernization is one of the drivers right now, but it's fueled by two things or two views. One is, in SAP specifically, maintenance for the old systems is going to run out. So eventually I'm not going to support it anymore. I mean, that's something that if that hits you, you're in a bad position, right? Because you're basically being beaten with this project. You have to do it no matter what. You cannot choose the pace anymore. Then, of course, the other side of the coin is that, hey, this new system that we're going into, it's highly AI enabled, right? And if we get all this data in there, especially also historical one, and reshape it and basically bring it to a shape and form that now the new AI use cases available in that system can readily use this, that is going to be a bright future that really enables new business models, new business abilities that we basically have. So this, I would say, are the two most drivers that we see. The mergers and acquisitions happen all the time. And yes, of course, they also increasingly happen in this point. But I'd say the way of how you handle those is more of a, well, it's more of a bread and butter business for us. In the sense, the modernization piece is really where it's peaking right now.
So one of the things that we talk about with customers whenever they're doing things is having the right semantic foundation, right? The semantic architecture. What does that mean? That's starting with business concepts, and it's translating those business concepts into lots of different types of elements and processes and applications and workflows and systems and tools. And what's interesting is when you look at this from a data perspective, sometimes you miss certain context. And I want to give you an example and get your thoughts to this. If you think about data, you're talking about data, an element in a data field, right? You're talking about a very fine-grained application of a business concept to something that is structured or could be unstructured, but it's looking at that level of here's a field and here's a value in that field. Now, when I talk about this from a conceptual perspective, I use the example of a business term and an example of a collaboration environment like SharePoint. If you have a concept called methodology, right, which is very important to consulting business, you can have a site collection that's called methodology, right? So your business term, your business concept is methodology, and you name that site collection. You could also, and so that's one way of applying that element from your semantic architecture. Now, there's another level of granularity. We could say, well, I'm going to call a site methodology. So I could have a site collection that has lots of sites, and it's all about different kinds of methodology, or I can have a site that's about methodology. I could also have a library within that site, and I could call that methodology. I could have a list within the library called methodology. I could have a content type within that library called methodology. I could have a metadata field within that content type called methodology, or I can have a value within that control vocabulary list in that field called methodology. If I go right to the data architecture in the master data piece, I'm going right to that finest level of granularity, looking at the data in that field. Yet there are many other mechanisms and many other contexts. So sometimes when people say, oh, just add a term to the taxonomy, it's not that simple, right?
Because it means different things at various levels.
Different things at various levels. Do you, in your projects, do you begin with that domain model at all to talk about these different contexts? Or do you mostly, because again, the nature of the beast is you got to migrate this data, or do you mostly focus on the data elements? So tell me how you think about the semantic architecture infrastructure in an enterprise.
Okay, so I would take
you don't have to have the answer. Just let's noodle on it.
No. There is not the answer anyhow,
Right.
because stuff is moving all the time. But I would have an answer which is at least true from our perspective, right? So if you are in an SAP to SAP strict data migration field, you are a very lucky person actually, because SAP being a German company, you can imagine how they over-engineered and perfectly fine-grained formulated out the data model upmost to like the most granular thing, being very, very distinct. So in an SAP system, you find very little generic and shapeable terms. What you find instead is a myriad, and I mean like 100,000 database tables. And those 100,000 database tables in that system, and I kid you not, they have like 250 fields on average. And these fields on average typically have like multitudes of distinct values. What this means is that the metadata that you have available and the way of how the semantics are manifested in the system itself is very strict. And once you had the chance, such as we did, to basically chew on the system for 25 years, which of course evolved over time, but thankfully not so often in a destructive way, but more in an additive way, we got to learn a lot about how that data model works. So in that sense, actually, the terminology, the methodology, the taxonomy is pretty much set. Now there's an other side of the coin, because
but when you say it's set, but it's very dynamic, right? Because new products, new markets, new solutions, new tools.
From a value perspective, it actually is. From a value perspective, it actually is, right? Because I mean, of course, customers do encode their semantics and their processes specifically into the customization. I mean, I said earlier on that one of the big things about SAP was how you can like twist and tweak the system to actually satisfy your needs. So of course, gaining an understanding, specifically at the very beginning of the phase, like what is actually in there. What data objects do they really use? How are they expressing, and how are they relating to the actual processes is of course of imminent importance, because you're going to migrate that, you're going to touch that, you're going to probably change that along the way. They need, of course, then finally end up in the data structures or in the semantics actually that they envision to be like their true business in the future. So a lot of what we do, I typically refer to this as value mapping versus structural mapping. So the structure in SAP pretty fixed, the value very, very fluent. And so the value mapping and like finding is how do you map the terminology from point A to point B, from system A to system B, is one of the dominant exercises that you undergo when you are in the blueprinting phase with a customer. You sit there with customers in workshops talking about, this value meant this before. I don't find this in the target system configuration. I found this X, Y, Z other values that might have the same meaning, the semantic meaning. Is this really the case? And also here, of course, AI can help a lot, because evaluation mostly then happens on things which are not strictly bound in the data model. They happen on the text level, where the semantics basically are implicitly encoded. And this is also where AI can actually help very much. So another point or another flip of this, to turn it even to more of an extreme, is when people want to move into an SAP system, they come from a non-SAP system. Classical case of re-standardization. I build a homegrown tool for some sort of process in my corporation. That guy that built it back then, or that girl that built it back then, they're long gone, they're retired. And actually this imposes a big business risk. So, hey, can we get rid of this system as we are moving into a new one? Now, this case, you don't have an implicit understanding of the source system. Here, you need to gain an understanding of the source system. And you would go there with like very traditional means. You would look at tables and data structures and values in there, but you would try to understand really is the business meanings, the concepts, the objects out of that. Where exactly in which 5 tables does the material sit, or does the product sit? How is the product configuration actually manifested in that system? How does it relate to POs, purchase orders? How does it relate to invoices? That type of understanding, for many times very technical terminology that you have available in the system, is there the predominant thing that you need to do to gain a semantic understanding of the system, so you actually are able to move it into the target later on.
So you're saying that a lot of that stuff is kind of predetermined, predefined, pre-mapped. But then there's still, if you think of a pace layering approach, right, there are things that are very stable that move at a very slow clock speed, which I think of ERP systems, and there are things that move at a much faster pace, and you have different layers of this. And, what happens in social media and marketing and messaging and sales and all that, it happens very, very, very quickly, right? So there are distinct layers and levels of speed of change, and then there are friction points in between, right? But where you have a slower paced system interfacing with a faster paced system. So,
or at least a slower changing system, right?
That's right. Slower changing system. Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. So I'm not completely clear on how that is considered, or is it not something that's really considered? It has to be thought of from a different perspective. So you're working on the foundation, because part of what we've done in the past, we've been brought in to build that semantic architecture and build that, the control vocabularies and the classifications and the categories and all the different things and the data models to support ERP, but also to support unstructured processes and knowledge processes, because it really should be holistic. You should have consistent organizing principles across all of your structured and unstructured information. And we have a reference architecture that kind of talks about that, right? But so how do you think about that, and what's the practical advice for an organization that has to deal with this? Again, ERP is much slower changing, and it requires that stability. It requires more of an enterprise data architecture perspective. It requires, change management boards and decision making, whereas there are other areas that are going to be much faster, like much less oversight, much less governance. So how do you think of governance and decision making at these two ends of the spectrum, the very slow moving, the very fast moving? Is that a fair question for you?
I mean, probably what you not want but need to actually build is, like you say, you need to build a ontology on top of what your business actually is.
Yes.
And this is typically involving much more than just your ERP system. I mean, where ERP system has a certain gravity to it, because ultimately this is where your production basically runs on. This is probably also where your invoicing runs on. Is this where your CRM processes run on? Most likely not these days, right? Does all of your supply chain run there? Well, no, most likely not. So, I mean, your whole enterprise architecture is, of course, much more complicated than that, involves many, many more systems. And you do actually, to make good decisions from a business perspective, need to, of course, take into account all of these different aspects, basically all these different systems. And many times approaches being taken here is that you actually take the data out of relevant data out for decision making out of these systems of record, put it into a data lake that is infledged with the ontology that you have as a company. That's something that you built by yourself, right? That's your actions, that's your objects, that's your events that are basically happening, and you build it as an abstraction on top of what your systems actually imply. And most of the times, it's a much more simpler view, abstracted away from the technology that basically sits underneath. And then what you need to do is, of course, extract the right data out of the systems and bring them into those data lakes to support the decision-making processes and level out with this the different speeds that the different systems basically have. So that is what the typical approach is. Is that recommendation? No, I think that's just a fact how like enterprises act, basically.
Yeah. No, those are valid points. We like to think about, and we just have been writing about this and in our recent webinars on AI, and we have one coming up on governance next week. We talked last week about information leverage points, right? Where you're looking at everything is an information flow in the enterprise. Output is another person's input. And at the end of the day, you're taking in signals from the marketplace. You're taking in information. Money is even information, right? We don't walk around with gold Krugerrands and hand them to people. We take in ones and zeros, and then we put out information. Even products, even if you're a product company, raw material plus information is a product, right? So a design, I like to say my magical device is sand, metal, and oil, all very cleverly arranged, right? My iPhone.
True.
Right. And so that's, hundreds of thousands of person years of knowledge and information. So when you think about what we're trying to do with all of these things, we're trying to speed up those information flows. I call that the information metabolism of the organization. And then we're looking for places where there's friction, right? And sometimes when you're building a semantic architecture, you're not necessarily solving one specific problem. You're solving lots of little problems. It's like you're getting pecked to death by ducks, right? When you have all these information friction points where, there's a manual process here, or there's a translation here, or this person has to wait for this data to be validated, or you have to go in and check for compliance, or you have a manual process or a spreadsheet, whatever it might be. But those are little things that in and of themselves don't look like much, but they add up to a lot of friction throughout the organization. And there's kind of a fractal nature of processes within the organization, and lots of information flows that have other information flows that have other information flows, right? So when you build that semantic architecture, and when you modernize these environments, you're speeding up all of those flows of information, and you're letting people, that way you can get to products to market faster. You can react to competitive threats. You can react to changes in customer needs and all of those types of things. And that's what we're trying to do with normalization of data and architecture, as well as implementation of AI and AI initiatives. So when you're thinking about, this all becomes very complex because we have more interconnected systems. We're building more autonomous systems. Risk management becomes more challenging. What have you seen work to kind of maintain control, transparency, and accountability when you're starting to look at these critical enterprise processes? Maybe that's a little bit outside of your focus or your bailiwick, but maybe you could speak to that from what you've seen when you're at these organizations, and these are such critical processes and critical projects that are big investments.
Yeah. There's various ways of how to tackle that. Some organizations just let it flow, basically, and have little governance over the thing, right? And over how processes evolve and how they basically lead to all the constructs that you just referred to, right? Manual process in between, everything. Basically, everything is like a network, right? It's like basically a big flow with many decision points, some manual, some automatic, some are structured, some are governed, some are basically not. And some companies basically let it flow in specific areas, and other companies try to stay on top of this, right? And then what happens is there is this indexing or this redocumentation projects that are basically happening. And that's like, hey, let's put all of our processes into one system and have them well documented and all that sorts of stuff. In my experience, many times these are one-time efforts which are happening. And then after they are there, everybody's like tapping on their shoulders, like, yeah, we did great. And if they didn't great, they do like they did great, basically. And then from that point on, what most of the time is lacking from my perspective is the governance downstream that really ensures that the consistency that you might have achieved, or at least the improvements in consistency that you might have achieved, they decay away pretty quickly once you lose sight of what you're actually doing. So if you don't, with a change, also establish a governance, if you didn't have it, chances are you didn't, right? And you didn't establish it with a process, chances are you did this for once and you will not have the benefits for long in your corporation. So I would say, rather than re-architecting the whole thing, trying to stay on top of everything, try to identify what the critical processes really are, that if they are not exercised correctly, really hurt your business. And not everything is at the same level there, right? There are side processes, there are variants, which are, I'm not saying insignificant, but maybe they are just like rarely existing, and they are not meant to like completely automate in this particular case. Try to find where the value really lies, or if you can't find where the value really lies, try to find where your risk really lies. Think about the last escalations that you basically had because of a system not working, of a process being stuck, of a decision that could not have been taken or that wasn't taken basically in the past. Identify those points, find a remediation for that. I'm not even saying like what the remediation actually is, but establish a governance on top of that at the point that you identify. So you're sure that in the future, this thing doesn't break. If I take an analogy from a software development perspective, there's such a thing as test-driven development. And test-driven development basically is the practice of you stand up the contract of how it should work before you actually do the implementation. Now, despite this sounds very, very tempting to actually implement, few organizations do that, really, because it comes with some cost. It comes with less spontaneity, and you need to do a lot more thinking basically up front. So many organizations do actually choose to do another path. But if you find a critical error, You want to make sure this thing is going to be tested in the future, so at least that thing does not happen again. That's the bare minimum of what you need to be doing. So of course, like everything in life, it's about finding a balance. Basically, it needs experience to find the balance. At this point, the only thing that I can really like solidly pledge for is like, when you find such a thing, make sure you establish a governance that makes sure this stuff does not fail anymore in the future, and you have other problems to take care of next day. Not the same problems again.
Yeah. And I think the governance piece is so important because there are different tiers of risk, right? And you need to make the punishment fit the crime. You need to make sure that you have the right level of oversight at each tier, and building libraries of use cases to say what good looks like, right? So when this is done, what's this going to do? And that talks about the piece of functionality is that it can't fail here. Well, what's it supposed to do, right? What's the positive of that, the affirmative of that to say, this is what it needs to do. And then we have to test, right? We have to have a baseline to say, what's the current state? Now we have our intervention. Now we test again. And that becomes part of our KPIs. And so establishing those KPIs across the board at the different levels of granularity are really what governance is about, as well as having the right level of decision making. So the right structures of committees, working groups, task forces, right? And then the right working agendas and then the right measures to understand where people are doing that. So governance, I totally agree, is a very important area. That is our next webinar. I'm just going to pitch that here, although this will probably not be posted by the webinar. So the webinar was on March 11th. I'll speak in the past and some people can look at that. But where else can people find information about you and about your organization? We'll put stuff in the show notes, but how do people get in touch with you?
Well, of course, naturally, you can get in touch with LinkedIn, right? You can find stuff on the company's page. What I would recommend, though, if you want to see like how we actually move data, no, even better, how customers give statements about what their journeys were, what the challenges were, and how they actually overcome it, with or without us as a company here or with our platform, I can highly recommend you coming to Transformation World, which is a key event. It's happening once a year. This time it's in July 8th and 9th. If you happen to be in Germany or you can arrange it, it's a great conference actually to go to and real life get experience from customers, because that's what it's all about. It's a community event, right? It's where customers speak about their journeys, about their challenges, and how they actually solve them independent of the
technology agnostic. And so that is there a virtual version of that, or is it just face-to-face? Is it just live?
Well, I mean, it is an in-person version, but of course, we are providing all the contents, the sessions and stuff like that. Also, of course, for past Transformation Worlds up in YouTube, on our channels, and so on and so forth.
Any final words for executives in terms of what they need to look at, what they need to think about, what they should be prioritizing moving forward?
Yeah, so generally speaking, when you're an executive, find a problem worth solving, right? Don't find the easy problem, right? Which is like giving you like quick dopamine kicks and giving your organization a quick boost. Find something that really matters, right? In the end, and try to either put an automation on top of that, put a governance on top of that. And if that's a transformation project in the end that modernizes your systems, so be it. Is it something else? Then be it something else, basically. But try to make a meaningful impact by looking at your organization holistically and finding the spot where differentiation really makes an impact.
That sounds great. Dominic, thank you so much for your time today. It was great to have you. I appreciate your thoughts and your insights.
Thank you so much, Seth, for having me.
And thank you to our audience. And we will see you next time at the next Early AI podcast. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for joining us on another deep dive into AI innovation. Tune in next time when we introduce another industry expert and discuss how to maximize AI in your world. The Early AI podcast is sponsored by Early Information Science and Vector. To learn more, visit early.com. That's EARLEY.com. Thank you for tuning in.